She tried to question his grace. She tried to question his truth. But Obama's reply? It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was simply brilliant. And it ended the argument before it began. The hall was filled with the low hum of conversation. Cameras clicked softly, lights flashed, and reporters adjusted their microphones as people waited for the event to begin. It wasn't just another political gathering. Everyone in that room knew this one felt different. There was a kind of tension that hung in the air, polite on the surface but restless underneath. Then the noise began to fade. Conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the stage as Barack Obama walked out. He wasn't in a rush. He moved with the same quiet confidence people remembered. Calm, steady, collected. He gave a small nod to the crowd before taking his place at the podium. For a few seconds, he didn't speak. He just looked out over the audience, the cameras, the officials, the ordinary citizens, and waited until every whisper had faded into silence. When he finally began, his voice carried that familiar, balanced tone that always seemed to command attention without ever demanding it. America, he began, has been through difficult times before, but every challenge we face has shown us something powerful, that our greatest strength is not found in fear or anger, but in how we come together when it matters most. The crowd listened carefully. There was something in his delivery that drew people in, a kind of calm fire that made you want to hear more. He spoke of the country's wounds, but also its will to heal. He talked about families struggling to pay for food, young people searching for opportunity, and older Americans feeling forgotten. He didn't use fancy words. He didn't shout. He simply spoke with clarity, painting a picture of a country that was still standing tall, still capable of greatness, but only if it remembered its heart. He said, "It's easy to talk about winning. It's easy to claim that everything is perfect, but real leadership means facing what's broken, not pretending it isn't there." The audience reacted with a quiet murmur of approval. Some nodded. Others smiled faintly. It wasn't excitement in the air. It was something deeper. Respect. Obama went on, describing the balance between strength and humility. He talked about what it truly meant to lead, not as a show of power, but as an act of service. When we speak of grace, he said, we shouldn't think of it as charm or elegance. Grace is the strength to stay calm when the world pushes you to anger. Grace is listening even when you've already been misunderstood. The crowd fell completely silent now. Every word seemed to hang in the air a little longer than the one before it. He paused for a moment, taking in the room. You could almost hear the breathing of the audience waiting for what he would say next. Then, in that familiar rhythm that always gave his speeches their power, he continued, "I've met families who have lost everything and still choose kindness. I've seen young people who have no reason to hope but still choose to believe. That's what keeps this country alive. Not hate, not greed, not pride, but the quiet courage of people who refuse to give up on one another." Applause began softly, then grew louder. But even then, Obama held up his hand gently, signaling them to let him finish. He said, "Our country doesn't move forward when we tear each other apart. It moves forward when we remember that no one person, not a president, not a party, owns America's future. We all do." The applause this time was thunderous. For that brief moment, the whole room felt unified. Even those who disagreed with him couldn't deny the weight of his words. There was a peace in the air, the kind that comes when someone speaks truth without needing to shout it. But deep in the crowd, a few faces didn't clap. One of them was Melania Trump. She sat perfectly still, her expression composed, her eyes focused on Obama as if studying every word, every pause. To her, his calm tone didn't sound inspiring. It sounded like a challenge. Obama continued for a few more minutes, thanking citizens for their resilience and reminding everyone that progress takes patience. No matter how divided we become, he said, we owe it to ourselves and to each other to rise above smallness. Then, as he closed, he added one last thought that felt like it had been saved for someone specific. "Grace," he said softly, "isn't about standing taller than others. It's about reaching out even when someone tries to pull you down." The words echoed through the room like a slow wave. He stepped back slightly from the podium, and the applause grew once again. Strong, unified, honest. But as the sound filled the air, Melania Trump's gaze didn't move. She kept her hands folded, her posture perfect, her smile polite but cold. Behind that calm look, something was building, a reaction that was waiting for its moment. Because while Obama's words had moved the room, they had also struck a nerve, and everyone would soon find out that Melania Trump wasn't going to let those words stand unanswered. As the applause slowly faded, the cameras shifted toward the front row. Sitting there, perfectly composed, was Melania Trump. Her hands were crossed neatly on her lap, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, they carried something sharper than politeness. She had listened to every word Obama spoke, the tone, the message, the small moments of praise that the crowd offered him, and now she was ready to speak. When she stood, the room reacted instantly. Some people clapped out of courtesy. Others leaned forward, curious. Melania wasn't someone who spoke often, but when she did, she chose her words carefully. Her tall figure, poised and elegant, commanded attention without her having to raise her voice. "Thank you," she began softly, her accent smooth and deliberate. President Obama spoke very beautifully, as he always does. The crowd stayed quiet, waiting. Melania smiled, but there was something different behind it, a touch of irony. "But sometimes," she continued, "beautiful words can hide a lack of results. And sometimes people mistake calm speeches for real leadership." There it was, the first sting. A few gasps rippled through the room. Some shifted in their seats. Others looked toward Obama, who remained still, hands folded in front of him. Melania went on, her tone growing firmer with each sentence. "My husband, President Donald Trump, has faced criticism from every direction. Yet he never stopped fighting for this country. He made America strong again. He made America proud again. And he gave people hope. Not with speeches, but with action." The room erupted in polite applause from one side, mostly from her supporters. But the other side stayed quiet. The energy in the room was changing. It wasn't just a political discussion anymore. It was turning into something much more personal. Melania looked around as if measuring her words before delivering the next blow. "We are living in the best era our nation has seen in decades," she declared. "Jobs are growing. Borders are secure. Families are safe. That is grace, not words, but strength. True grace is loyalty. Loyalty to your people and to your husband when the world turns against you." Her gaze drifted toward Obama again, just for a second, but everyone noticed it. The meaning behind her words couldn't be mistaken. She wasn't simply praising Trump. She was challenging Obama's legacy and his very idea of grace. The tension was thick now. The audience could feel it. Every word was a needle, and Melania was threading them carefully one by one. She continued, "When the last administration left office, our country was divided, uncertain, and weak. We had lost faith in leadership. We had lost trust in promises, and yet some people still speak as if that time was full of unity and progress." Her tone hardened slightly. "Let's be honest," she said. "America was struggling. The people were struggling. But under President Trump, we have found a new spirit, a stronger heart. That is the truth." For a moment she looked proud, almost triumphant. But then, her next line cut deeper than any before. "Grace is not about smiling in front of cameras or giving pretty speeches," she said sharply. "Grace is standing beside your husband and your country, even when you are attacked from every side. That is what I have done, and that is what I will continue to do." There was a strange silence that followed. The applause that came next felt forced, uneven, like people clapping because they didn't know what else to do. The energy in the hall had shifted entirely. Melania wasn't finished. She looked directly at Obama, and though her voice stayed calm, there was a hint of frustration now, almost irritation. "You talk about unity, Mr. Obama, but where was your unity when people needed it most? When the country was breaking apart, you gave speeches. My husband built solutions." She paused for just a second, letting that line hang heavy in the air. Some people whispered under their breath. The camera zoomed in closer. It wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was an attack, wrapped in civility, but sharp enough to cut through the air. She continued, "You say grace means patience and compassion. But for me, grace means strength, standing tall when others wish to see you fall. Grace is not about being liked. It is about being right. Her words echoed around the hall. Some nodded approvingly. Others looked uneasy. Then she added something that would shift the entire tone of the evening. And maybe, she said slowly, the reason some people talk about Grace so much is because they no longer understand what real strength looks like. That was the moment everything changed. You could feel the temperature in the room drop slightly. Even those who supported her could sense that she had crossed a line, not visibly, but emotionally. The camera caught a glimpse of Obama's face. He didn't move, didn't frown, didn't speak. His silence said everything. Melania smiled again, but this time it looked practiced, too sharp, too careful. She ended her speech by saying, "We brought back pride to America. We brought back respect. We brought back greatness. That is the meaning of grace." Her words hung in the air like smoke after a spark. She stepped away from the microphone, leaving behind a trail of unease that no applause could clear. Some people clapped politely. Others looked to Obama, wondering what he would do next. He had been challenged not only as a former president, but as a person. His legacy, his integrity, his grace all called into question in front of the nation. And yet, he didn't rush to respond. He simply stood still, waiting, because everyone in that hall could feel it. Melania's attack wasn't the end of the moment. It was the beginning of something far more explosive, something that would make this night unforgettable. For a moment, the room stood frozen. Melania Trump had finished her speech, her final words still hanging in the air like the echo of a sharp blade. The applause that followed wasn't real applause. It was hesitant, unsure, broken into small bursts from different corners of the hall. People were watching, waiting. They knew something was coming. Barack Obama remained still for several seconds. His calm expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. A quiet steadiness, the kind that appears right before a storm. He walked back to the podium slowly, each step measured, unhurried. The crowd grew silent again. The cameras zoomed in. It felt as though the entire hall was holding its breath. When Obama finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "I want to thank Mrs. Trump," he said evenly, "for sharing her thoughts." There was no sarcasm in his tone, no visible anger. That alone made the silence even heavier. He let a few seconds pass before continuing. "You see, I understand where that passion comes from. We all love our country. We all want to see it strong. We all want to see our people live better lives," he paused, then added. "But sometimes, loving your country means having the courage to face the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Melania sat still, her eyes fixed on him, her posture perfect. Obama continued, "It's easy to talk about greatness. It's harder to look around and see that some people are still struggling. Families trying to afford medicine, parents working 3 jobs, senior citizens choosing between food and rent. That's not the picture of a nation that has reached its best days. That's a call to keep working." His tone was steady, but the power behind his words was building, like the slow roll of thunder before lightning strikes. "True leadership," he said, "isn't about saying everything is perfect. It's about admitting what isn't, and doing the work to fix it." A wave of soft applause started from one side of the room, but Obama didn't pause for it. He kept going. "I've heard people say that this is the best era America has ever seen. But tell that to the workers who lost their homes. Tell that to the families who can't afford health care. Tell that to the children who still go to bed hungry in the richest country on earth." His voice grew firmer now. The calm was still there, but the energy beneath it had become undeniable. "America's strength has never come from pretending we're perfect," he said. "It comes from our willingness to admit when we're not, and our determination to do better." You could feel the room shift again. The energy that Melania had created, sharp, defensive, almost proud, began to fade, replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful air. Obama leaned slightly forward as he continued. "Mrs. Trump said grace means standing beside your husband when the world turns against you. And I respect loyalty. But grace, true grace, isn't loyalty to one person. It's loyalty to what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something." The crowd reacted quietly. A few nodded, a few gasped softly. Melania's expression didn't change, but there was a faint tension in her jaw now. Obama looked across the hall again, his tone lowering just enough to draw people in. "Grace," he said, "isn't about power. It isn't about applause. It's about humility. It's the strength to listen before you speak, to understand before you accuse, to serve before you rule. His words carried a strange kind of stillness, not loud, not angry, but undeniable. He took a breath. Now I know people want to talk about success and winning, and that's fine, but we should never confuse winning with leading. Winning is about competition. Leading is about compassion. It's about lifting others even when you could stand taller by stepping on them. The line hit hard. Even those who disagreed couldn't look away. Obama continued, his voice softening slightly, but the edge in his message was unmistakable. When I hear people say that the past left this country in disarray, I remind them, the problems we face now didn't begin yesterday. They've been building for decades, and they'll only get better when we stop blaming and start working together again. He let that settle for a few seconds. Then, in a tone that was almost reflective, he said, "We can't keep pretending that strength is the same thing as grace." One shouts. The other listens. One demands respect. The other earns it. There was a pause. Long, deliberate, like the world had stopped spinning for a second. And then he added, "When you choose strength without grace, you might win the moment, but you lose the soul of what you're fighting for." The silence after that was deep. The audience didn't move. Melania didn't blink. Even the air in the room seemed to have changed. Thicker, heavier, more alive. Obama finally stepped back, offering a faint, polite smile. "That," he said, "is what I believe America needs right now. Not louder voices, but kinder hearts." This time, when the applause came, it wasn't hesitant. It was strong, unified, and filled the entire hall. Melania's expression remained composed, but inside, something had shifted. Her speech had been meant to cut, to prove her family's strength. But Obama's reply had turned that blade around. Quietly, elegantly, without ever raising his voice. Everyone could feel it. The balance had shifted, and though the room seemed to calm again, those who knew both of them understood something. This wasn't over. Melania Trump wasn't going to let that calm, clever rebuttal be the last word. The next moment would turn personal, and when it did, the tone of the evening would change forever. The applause from Obama's speech still echoed faintly when Melania Trump leaned toward the microphone again. Her smile had returned, soft on the outside, but her eyes told a different story. There was no calm in them now. What had begun as a polite debate about ideas was quickly turning into something far more personal. She waited just long enough for the noise to die down before speaking. "That was a very touching speech," she said with a slow, measured tone. "Very emotional. Very beautiful. You are always good with words, Mr. Obama." The audience held its breath. They could sense what was coming. Melania tilted her head slightly, her smile tightening. "But maybe it is time to stop hiding behind words and start showing something real." The hall fell silent again. She continued, her voice sharpening with every word. "You talk about grace, humility, and truth. But where is your own truth, Mr. Obama? You speak like you built this nation from your hands, but many still question who you really are. Maybe it is time you show your original birth certificate before you lecture others about honesty." Gasps rippled through the audience. It wasn't subtle anymore. It was a direct personal attack. A line had been crossed. Obama stood still, his face unreadable. But in that stillness was power. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that waits, calculates, and then strikes at the perfect moment. Melania, sensing the shock her words had caused, pressed on. "You talk about grace," she said again, her tone growing bolder. "But grace is not something you can rehearse in front of a mirror. It is something you live with, something people can see. You hide behind speeches, but where is the real man behind the smile?" Her words were like ice. Cold, deliberate, meant to sting. She straightened slightly, feeling the weight of the moment. "America deserves truth," she added. "And truth doesn't come from stories or style. It comes from proof." The room was now split. Some watched in disbelief, others whispered nervously, and a few nodded in quiet approval. Melania had turned a political disagreement into a confrontation that felt deeply personal, almost cruel. She smiled faintly, perhaps expecting silence or retreat. But Obama finally looked up, and when he spoke, his tone was soft, too soft for what came next. "I see," he said calmly. "We've moved from ideas to identities." His voice carried a steadiness that drew everyone in again. I suppose that's easier, he said. When it's too hard to answer questions about people's pain, it's simpler to ask about someone's papers. The audience murmured, but Obama didn't stop. You say you want truth. Here's a truth. Every time we make politics about personality instead of purpose, every time we point fingers instead of holding hands, we lose something that makes this country special. He paused, then looked directly at Melania. His voice stayed even, but the edge in it was unmistakable. You talk about grace, Mrs. Trump, but grace isn't something you use as a weapon when you're angry. Grace doesn't demand someone else's papers before it offers respect. The crowd stirred again. Melania's lips tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Obama leaned slightly forward, his words slower now, each one landing with precision. You want to talk about identity? Let's talk about it. You want to know who I am? I'll tell you. I'm a father who taught his daughters to lead with kindness. I'm a husband who learned that real strength doesn't come from raising your voice, but from listening. I'm a man who believes that leadership without empathy is just power in disguise. The applause started to rise. But Obama lifted his hand slightly, not to silence them, but to prepare them. And since we're talking about grace, he said, pausing for just a heartbeat, I have a question of my own. The audience grew still again. The tension was electric. He looked directly at Melania, his tone calm but razor-sharp. When, he asked quietly, do you stop playing Barron's mom? The entire hall gasped. For a second, it felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. The question was simple, almost gentle in sound, but it carried an unmistakable weight. Melania blinked, visibly taken aback. The smile she had worn froze mid-expression. The silence that followed was unbearable. Long, suffocating, filled with the shock of what had just been said. Obama didn't raise his voice or look triumphant. He simply let the question linger, like a challenge that no one wanted to touch. He finally added, Grace, Mrs. Trump, is knowing when to speak and when to stop performing. The crowd erupted. Applause roared through the hall, not out of mockery, but out of awe. People weren't cheering a fight. They were reacting to precision. Obama hadn't shouted. He hadn't insulted. But his words had hit exactly where they were meant to. Melania sat frozen, her eyes unblinking. She looked at him, then at the crowd, trying to hold her composure. But the energy had shifted completely. Obama's calmness had turned her attack inside out. Every word she had thrown at him had been reflected back, reframed and dismantled. Not with rage, but with control. The applause grew louder. Some people stood. Others whispered in disbelief. Obama stepped back slightly from the podium, his expression as calm as when he began. Now, he said, perhaps we can return to the real question. Not who we are, but what we choose to become. The line landed perfectly. It was more than a response. It was a turning point. Melania didn't respond. She didn't have to. Everyone could see it in her face, in that mix of shock and restraint. The realization that a single question had undone everything she had built in that moment. The confrontation had begun as an argument about leadership. It had turned into a battle over truth. But now it was something else entirely. A quiet reckoning. One not by power but by poise. And though the applause filled the room once again, it couldn't drown out the one question that still hung in the air, echoing in every corner of that hall. When do you stop playing Barron's mom? It was the kind of question that didn't just end an argument. It ended the performance. The air was thick with shock. Obama's final question still lingered in every corner of the hall, pulsing like an unspoken echo no one dared to break. Melania Trump sat motionless, her smile gone, her gaze fixed on the stage but not really seeing it. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table before her. For the first time that evening, she looked unsettled. The applause for Obama continued to swell, steady, powerful, filled with a sense of collective release. But beneath that applause was something heavier, tension, confusion, and curiosity. People weren't just reacting to his words. They were waiting to see what would happen next. And then when the noise faded, Melania rose to her feet again. Her expression was calm once more. Perfectly controlled, but her voice carried a new tone. Not graceful, not gentle, but sharp, almost icy. Mr. Obama, she said slowly, I think you forget yourself. The hall fell quiet again. You talk about grace as if you own the word, she continued. You question who I am as a mother, as a woman, and yet you speak of empathy. You speak of listening. Her voice grew stronger, her accent thicker, every syllable deliberate. You want to talk about families? Let's talk about them. You talk of love, but you question mine. You speak of truth, but you hide yours. Her words were carefully measured, but her frustration showed through the polish. She wasn't smiling now. Her tone had shifted from elegance to defiance. Maybe you are right, she said. Maybe I am just playing my role, a wife, a mother. But at least I do not pretend to be something I am not. I do not stand on a stage talking about grace and unity while dividing people with my words. A few claps broke out, quickly silenced by the tension that followed. Melania stepped closer to the podium, her posture tightening. You ask when I stop playing Barron's mother, she said, her eyes locked on Obama. Maybe when you start showing your real birth certificate. Maybe when you show America who you truly are. The audience gasped again, the shock renewed. She had brought it back, the old accusation, the question of Obama's identity. It was meant to sting, to turn the conversation back in her favor, to make him look defensive. But Obama didn't look shaken. His expression remained calm, almost pitying, and that only seemed to frustrate her more. Melania pressed on, her words tumbling faster now, her composure cracking at the edges. You stand there and talk about listening, but you do not listen. You speak of unity, but you judge. You think grace is about quiet words and soft tones. It's not. Grace is strength. Grace is knowing when to walk away. She stopped, catching her breath as though realizing she had gone further than she meant to. Then, in a move that felt both impulsive and calculated, she delivered her final blow. Show your real birth certificate, she repeated coldly. Then I will talk with you. And with that, she turned to leave. The audience stirred, unsure whether to applaud, react, or stay silent. Some whispered in disbelief, others simply watched her go. The atmosphere had changed again. Not victorious, not defeated, but uneasy. Her words had landed, but they hadn't done what she intended. Instead of looking powerful, she looked cornered. Obama remained where he was, his face calm and his posture steady. When the murmurs quieted, he spoke one final time, not to argue, but to reclaim the air in the room. He said, "Grace is not about how loud you leave. It's about how much truth you leave behind." The room erupted into applause once more, louder than before. The sound rolled through the hall like thunder, drowning out the awkward shuffle of footsteps as Melania disappeared behind the curtain. But the story didn't end there. Her departure had left behind more than silence, and it had left questions. Questions that spread like sparks. Who was right? Who had shown real grace? And more importantly, who had revealed their true self when the pressure rose? Obama stood quietly, taking in the moment. He hadn't shouted, hadn't insulted, yet somehow, he had unraveled an entire performance built on pride and deflection. His calm was his power, the kind of control that comes from knowing that truth, even when whispered, speaks louder than accusation. As the applause faded, he spoke one last time, his voice softer now, but heavy with meaning. Every time we choose pride over truth, we lose a little of what makes us human. And every time we meet anger with calm, we remind the world that grace still matters. Those words settled over the crowd like a blanket. Even those who didn't agree with him couldn't deny the feeling that something profound had just happened. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about character, about the difference between reacting and responding, between attacking and understanding. Outside the hall, the air was cool and still. People walked away slowly, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Some said Obama had ended her argument with a single question. Others said Melania had shown boldness, standing her ground. But everyone agreed on one thing. They had seen a clash unlike any other, one built on grace. The other built on pride, and somewhere in that clash, the truth about both of them had quietly revealed itself. Before leaving, Obama turned to the audience once more, offering a final reflection, not as a politician, but as a man. The measure of grace, he said, isn't in how you speak when people agree with you. It's in how you hold your peace when they don't. Then he smiled faintly, that quiet, knowing smile that had once inspired millions. So tonight, he said, ask yourself not who won, but who kept their grace when it mattered most. The crowd rose in one final unified applause. It wasn't for victory or defeat, but for a moment that had peeled back the layers of power and pride, revealing something raw, something human. And as the lights dimmed, one truth remained in that hall on that night. Words had once again proven mightier than power.